Chapter 9 talks about assessing reading comprehension and skills and related skills. So I just want to have a discussion about and kind of give you my opinion on how to assess reading comprehension and how to go about deciding what test and how to test this very vital skill. Kilpatrick starts talking about, which one of our 4 major reading difficulty patterns struggle with reading comprehension. And honestly, most of them do. Your compensator, not as much, but your hyperlexic, your dyslexic, and your mixed are going to be the ones that are going to have a bigger deficit, okay? Here's a problem with reading comprehension tests. So, they're not all created equal. They're not all gonna tell you exactly what the issue with comprehension is. You will know that they are poor comprehenders based on the questions that they ask, but you're not gonna know how to fix the issue. Now, when you're assessing reading comprehension, and you're using a standardized test that's already been given, it may tell you like what type of question it is and where in the Bloom's taxonomy of question asking the students are deficient in, but, but it's not going to give you, it's not going to tell you right away, this is where the issue is. This is where the problem lies. They will tell you, poor comprehender. Now you have to figure out what to do next. So, the book talks about a closed read and talks about how to use a closed read, not the closed read you did, the different closed read, the one where you fill in the blank. I don't know if I would use that as a comprehension assessment. As I was saying, I'm not sure the closed read is a great indicator of a comprehension issue, but I would say that it's a good way to see kind of where they're at. At the end of the day, you have to kind of figure out how you're going to assess them with comprehension. You can ask them to give you a storied retell. So a word for word story retell like they do in Dibbles. If they can go back and give you word for word. A story retell might be the best way to tell how much they've been able to comprehend. It's a little bit less formal. So you take away when you're having a discussion with them and you say, okay, tell me what the story is about. There's a little bit less anxiety and a little bit less, like a wall where you're like, oh, I'm taking a test where the students have to paper and pencil bubble things in, or they're in a computer answering questions. There's not that moment of unsureness. When they're conversating or talking to you and you're saying, hey, tell me what the story is about, they're a little bit less intimidated than they are taking a test. Researchers have shown that story retell could possibly be a good indicator of comprehension and comprehension monitoring. Is there a best test? No, there isn't. Comprehension evaluation, I think, needs to be, just like anything else, multiple different aspects need to be tested for you to know whether they know what the story is about. I will say this, there is a place for comprehension tests. There is a place for, in literacy and in your reading program, for students to take a comprehension test based on what they read. Now, the key to those comprehension tests. So, take your journey reading once a week deal that you do in your journey book or in your basal reader. The students have to have multiple exposures to that text to be able to be successful in a comprehension test. So they need to interact with the text 4 times before you can expect them to successfully take a comprehension test and pass it. Okay, so whether it's day 1, you read the story aloud. Day 2, they listen to the story, the audio. Day 3, they read with a partner. And day 4, they read in a group. Now they've had 4 exposures. Okay, they can't read the story on Monday, not see the story again until Friday, and you give them a comprehension test with 10 questions. What are we doing? No. So comprehension monitoring is something you have to work on. So with those 4 text exposures, they have to be doing something with the text for it to come to life. If not, we're not doing anything. So when you're solely testing comprehension, like a DIBELS or any other standardized test, an oral fluency or oral passage fluency exam or a running record that you're going to add comprehension to, that's different. But when you're teaching comprehension and you're teaching comprehension skills, you have to have them have exposure to the text in order for them to be successful. There's a place for both in your literacy program. Comprehension monitoring throughout, and then testing for comprehension, a place for both, and they have to work together. This test, the comprehension test with 0 exposure, will improve if you use comprehension monitoring strategies in your classroom. Got a little bit off on a tangent, but I'm coming back. Okay, more on reading comprehension. If the student can listen and is able to tell you, you know that they fall under a certain pattern. So the rapid reference box on page 234, I think is super important. It tells you, listening comprehension, reading comprehension, verbal IQ. And if it gives you, if you can pull that information, you could see what reading difficulty pattern they fall under, and then you know how to fix it because you know what the weaknesses are. That rapid reference box even tells you what area you would need to address to help them. I think it's a great box. I think you need to look at it. I think it's something that you need to have in your back pocket. Now, what do you need to assess to be able to get a full picture of a reading comprehension test? Okay, the first thing you need to test. Okay, you can't just test reading comprehension. We know because we've talked about it, there are several components to reading comprehension. So the first thing that you need to also test to be sure you have a clear picture of what the issue is in reading comprehension is vocabulary. Okay, so vocabulary has to be tested, and vocabulary tests are very easy. Okay, a standard vocabulary test that the kid knows what the words mean and how to use the words correctly will give you an indication of where their comprehension is at. Okay, now we know if they have limited vocabulary, their comprehension is going to be weak. So in order for you to know what area in reading comprehension the issue is, you have to test vocabulary. Okay. Are there concerns with vocabulary? Yes, because some students are able to use context to figure out what words mean. Myself included, I was an ELO student. I remember being tested and having to use the words around the words I didn't know to be able to pass vocab stuff. So vocabulary is kind of a double-edged sword because your students that struggle with vocabulary can use context. The ones that have limited vocabulary, you're going to know based on one of these vocabulary tests. But the ones that may be struggling with vocabulary, this may be the indicator that might tell you, okay, this is what I need to work on. Okay? IQ test. So IQ tests don't help with word level reading problems, but they can give you an insight on reading comprehension. Low IQ, low performance. And unfortunately, it just is what it is. The mind is only able to have a certain amount of capacity. So if you have a low IQ kid, you know there's going to be a reading comprehension issue. You know that there's going to be some type of processing issue that you're going to have to deal with. So an IQ test, when we are assessing comprehension, is a good indicator that there's an issue and that we're going to have to work on that issue. So, in each child's cum, you should be able to see a cumulative folder. You should be able to see their IQ score. So that would be an indication that reading comprehension may be an issue. So you're going to need to test that and have that test as well. Most of your 504 students or students that are on IEP will have an IQ test because that's part of standardized testing. The other side of comprehension, okay? So, background knowledge, which we know is part of comprehension, and we know it's something that we need to have an idea of. How do you test background knowledge? Hard because how do you put in a test to know what a child knows about? Okay, to me, a better background knowledge test is literally a reading interest survey that tells you what the child wants to read about. Okay, based on what the child wants to read about, gives you an idea of what their background knowledge is. And if you put a multitude of subjects on a number line and you tell them, okay, do you know a lot? Put a check mark. Do you know a little? Put an X. Do you know nothing? Put a sad face. You're going to know what topics they know about. So testing on background knowledge and specific topic knowledge area is difficult, but based on those informal reading surveys, you could have a clearer picture. Another area of testing would be working memory. And we know working memory falls under RAN, which is the rapid automized naming. So we know that if working memory is a struggle, and if we know that there's issues within working memory, how can we comprehend? Okay, working memory is where we store the short term and where it eventually goes into the long term. So if we don't have our working memory ready to go, comprehension is going to be an issue. So we need to know if working memory is functioning. The other area that they talk about is attention. Okay, you have to be able to have decent attention skills to be able to comprehend, because you have to stay focused for a longer period of time. So, students with ADHD and students with ADD struggle with reading comprehension because they have to stay focused for long periods of time. Okay, and even the book says, while students with attentional difficulties tend to have reading comprehension skills lower than their peers, There are students with ADHD and ADD with strong reading comprehension skills. So there is a way to train the mind for attention. A good way to train them, and this is a good intervention, is you start with 30 seconds of reading. Okay, read the passage for 30 seconds. Start, stop. Tell me what you remember. Okay, then you start with 30 seconds and then you build time, and you start that with your little bits when they start to read first grade. Okay, just like they do sprints in math, you can do sprints in reading. Okay, and as much as they read and can retell is how you're going to train their mind to read and to focus that attention. 30 seconds. Tell me what you can tell me about this story. Okay. Inferencing and comprehension monitoring. Hard to test inferencing unless you have questions, like just your standard questions. I think inferencing is a higher level thinking area. So I think when we talk about inference, that is on the top of reading comprehension. Do I think it's an area you need to test? No. Can it be included in a reading comprehension? Yes. Do we need to know if most students or any students struggle with inferencing? I think yes, because teaching the brain to think differently is part of being a good reading instructor. So I think inferencing is definitely something that needs to be addressed. It needs to be tested within a comprehension test, and you need to know if your students are struggling with it. This is a skill that has to be worked on for sure. The last thing they talk about is visual spatial. Or VISP. Sorry. Visually, the text has to be consistent, okay? So, I think that visual spatial is not like a major area that we need to test, but there is some correlation between poor visual conceptual, visual spatial perception and testing. There's not enough research on that, but I still think it's something that needs to be done. And you need to see if your students struggle with how the text is formatted and if they do better. A good way to do that is when you're mixing your passages, put a picture in the middle of it and have the reading go across the picture and see if your students do better or worse on that. My students always did worse because the text was not consistent. The font size is different, it's slanted, if the students can't see it correctly, all of those fall into that. Most importantly, what we need to know is that reading comprehension is not just a cookie cutter. Okay, there are several areas that need to be assessed to create your bigger picture. You as a teacher are going to be able to assess your students and know, okay, this kid is struggling here. Okay, this kid is struggling there, because you cannot solely base comprehension on 10 questions. You need to know what those questions are, how to address those questions, and how to make them better. Okay, so as we continue to put some of these things together, we need to know that assessment in comprehension is not just one way. It is several ways. So make sure you are getting a clear picture of your student that's struggling. Reading comprehension is a very, very vital skill to your students, and we have to be able to get them to remember what they read. It is on you to help them get to that point by knowing which areas to assess and how to fix it. Okay?